The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly in every direction, cracked and brittle like old skin. Beneath a sky bleached by sun, a young chestnut foal stood trembling, his legs bound in rusted shackles. The chain ran taut to the lifeless body of a mare, her eyes dull, her ribs carved by hunger. The wind made no sound but for the soft jingle of metal, echoing like guilt in a church hall. This was no accident of fate. It was a calculated decision made by Cressida Vale, a woman whose name was whispered with both admiration and fear across the Southwest. Her ranches were massive, her bloodlines legendary, her reputation polished like the boots she wore. But beneath that gleam was ice. The foal had been born with a slight twist in his hind leg, a flaw in Vale's empire of perfection. And in her eyes, flaws were to be erased, quietly and without mess. She ordered Alden Pike, her most trusted hand for nearly 2 decades, to dispose of the mare and her foal. Alden had followed orders his whole life. He wasn't proud of it, but he had long since learned to bury his conscience beneath calloused hands and worn-out routines. He drove the trailer deep into the desert before dawn, unchained the horses, and walked away. But he didn't forget the way the foal stumbled behind its mother, or how the mare turned to look at him one last time. 7 days passed, each one heavier than the last. Alden couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every night, he saw the foal's eyes in his mind, too young to understand betrayal, yet somehow still hopeful. On the 7th morning, he grabbed a jerrycan of water, 3 bales of hay, and drove back into the dust. What he found hollowed him out. The mare was dead, her body bloated in the heat. But the foal, miraculously, was still alive. Starved, dehydrated, barely standing, but alive. Alden dropped to his knees, unhooked the chain with trembling fingers, and whispered, "I'm sorry, boy. I should have never." But the words stuck. The foal didn't run. He simply leaned, just slightly, into Alden's hand. Alden named him Dusty, for the land that should have taken him. But Alden didn't just take home a horse that day. He carried with him a secret too heavy to bury any longer. Because Dusty's survival wasn't the only miracle. Eb Carson, an old horse wrangler with a long memory, would soon reveal a truth about Dusty's bloodline that Cressida Vale had tried desperately to erase, and the reason she wanted the foal gone was far more dangerous than anyone knew. The old barn behind Alden Pike's modest house hadn't been used in years, not since the droughts dried up the last of his grazing land. But that morning, he swept out the dust, laid down fresh straw, and hung a tarp over the back window to keep the sun from burning through. Dusty lay curled in the corner, too weak to stand, his chest rising slow and shallow. Alden had no plan. He only knew he couldn't let the colt die. He nursed him with small amounts of water, soaked oats, and crushed apples, whatever his fridge could offer. Every few hours, Dusty's ears twitched, or he shifted slightly in the straw, and each flicker of life felt like a small victory. Alden stayed by his side, sometimes dozing on a hay bale, waking to check the colt's breathing. He hadn't felt this kind of responsibility in years. It was frightening, and oddly comforting. But Alden also knew he'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Cressida Vale didn't tolerate disobedience, especially from those she considered beneath her. If she found out he'd brought the foal back, the consequences wouldn't just be professional. She'd bury him the same way she buried her mistakes, quietly, efficiently, and with enough money to make the law forget it ever happened. On the 3rd day, a pickup truck rumbled down the long gravel road toward Alden's property. He watched through the screen door, a shotgun leaned casually by the frame. But when the engine cut and the door opened, relief washed over him. Eb Carson stepped out, wearing his usual oil-stained hat and carrying a burlap feed sack like it weighed nothing. "Heard you been buyin' oats and blankets at the co-op," Eb said, his voice low and raspy. "That's odd for a man without livestock." Alden didn't answer right away. He just nodded toward the barn. Eb followed him inside, squinting in the dim light until his eyes landed on Dusty. He stood silent for a long moment. Then he whistled under his breath. "That's a fine-built colt. Shame what she did." His tone didn't ask for an explanation. "You know who that mare was, right?" Ebb added, turning slowly. "She wasn't just any broodmare. That was Seraphine's daughter." The name hit Alden like a blow to the chest. Seraphine. Cressida Vale's prized mare. The one rumored to have foaled a champion stud over a decade ago. A stallion whose bloodline had vanished without a trace. And now, staring at Dusty's quiet eyes, Alden felt it. This wasn't just a flawed colt. This was something Cressida had been hiding for years. And if the wrong people found out he was still alive, they wouldn't stop until he wasn't. That night, Alden lay awake on the cot in his small room above the barn, listening to Dusty shift in the straw below. The air was thick with summer heat and the weight of old memories. Ebb's words echoed like ghosts, Seraphine's daughter. It didn't make sense. Cressida Vale had claimed Seraphine died barren after one foal, a champion stallion who mysteriously disappeared before ever breeding. So why hide another offspring? Unless it threatened something? Alden remembered Seraphine well. She was unlike any horse he'd ever known, intelligent, proud, and fiercely maternal. Cressida had treated her like royalty until the day she disappeared. Rumors swirled back then. Seraphine was sold overseas, euthanized after an injury, stolen even. But now, looking back, it felt more like a cover-up. And if Dusty was truly her grandson, someone had been lying for a long time. The next morning, Alden walked into town to use the old library computer. He didn't trust doing searches from home, not with the kind of surveillance Cressida could afford. He dug through archived sales records, veterinary logs, and bloodline registries. One name kept coming up, Hollow Crown, the supposed lost son of Seraphine. Sold in a private transaction with no location listed. Disappeared just months after his first race. And then he found it, a scanned photograph in a faded equestrian magazine. Hollow Crown as a yearling, standing beside Seraphine. Alden stared at the image, heart tightening. The resemblance to Dusty was unmistakable. Same slope of the neck, same alert eyes. He printed the image and folded it into his jacket pocket, suddenly aware that he was in far deeper than he'd planned. Back at the barn, Ebb waited with his arms crossed. "You went diggin', didn't you?" he asked, not needing an answer. Alden handed him the photo silently. Ebb looked at it, then at Dusty, and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." His voice dropped. "If that colt's got even half of Hollow Crown in him, he ain't just rare. He's valuable. And dangerous to someone like Cressida." Alden's jaw tightened. "She left him to die, Ebb. Tied to his mother's corpse like trash." He paused. "What kind of woman does that?" Ebb didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because they both knew the kind of woman Cressida Vale was, and what she might be willing to do, if she found out Dusty was still alive. The days grew hotter, and Dusty grew stronger. His steps were steadier, his eyes brighter. But with every sign of recovery, Alden felt a deeper sense of dread. Keeping the colt alive wasn't just an act of mercy anymore, it was defiance. And Cressida Vale wasn't a woman who let defiance slide. She had resources, connections, and a long memory. Alden knew she'd start asking questions soon, if she hadn't already. Late one afternoon, while replacing Dusty's bandage, Alden noticed something strange. The latch on the side gate was open. He was sure he'd locked it that morning. Dusty hadn't left the barn, but someone had been there. Footprints in the dirt. Not his, not Ebb's. Fresh, wide, heavy. Someone had been watching. Maybe even closer than he realized. Alden scanned the horizon but saw nothing beyond the waving heat and dust. He didn't mention it to Ebb right away. Instead, he started sleeping in the barn full-time, shotgun propped against the wall, one eye always open. Dusty would often come close during the night, nuzzling Alden's shoulder as if sensing the change. You feel it too, don't you? Alden murmured, his voice low. The colt blinked slowly, his body warm and calm, but his ears twitched at every sound. 2 days later, Ebb arrived with more feed and a look that told Alden the silence was over. "Cressida's asking about you," he said, voice clipped. "Said you stopped showing up to the ranch meetings. Wants to know what you've been so busy with." Alden looked down at Dusty, now standing taller, healthier. "What'd you tell her?" Ebb gave a grim smile. "Told her you're old, bitter, and probably drunk." She believed it. But both men knew that wouldn't buy much time. Ebb walked the perimeter of the barn, checking for tracks, for signs. "You got maybe a week before she sends someone who ain't just looking." His voice lowered. "You need to decide what you're doing with him, Alden. You keepin' this colt is one thing. But if she catches wind of who he really is, she'll burn your whole damn world down to get to him." Alden ran a hand over his tired face. He thought of the years he spent loyal to Cressida, never questioning, never pushing back. Now he was risking everything for a colt that shouldn't even be alive. But as Dusty came and rested his head gently against Alden's arm, something inside him solidified. "He's not going back," Alden said. "Not to her. Not ever." What he didn't know was that someone had already taken a picture through the trees, and had sent it to a number Cressida Vale still answered. The black SUV appeared just after sunrise, its tinted windows gleaming like obsidian beneath the desert sun. It didn't turn up the main road. Instead, it parked half a mile out, just beyond the scrub line. Alden spotted it from his porch, coffee cup halfway to his mouth. His stomach dropped. That wasn't a visitor. That was a message. She knew. Or at least suspected enough to send someone to watch. Inside the barn, Dusty nickered softly, unaware of the storm closing in. Alden moved with quiet urgency, packing a canvas duffel with supplies, oats, bandages, a water jug. Ebb arrived minutes later, having spotted the same SUV from the ridge road. "She sent Monroe," Ebb said grimly. "That's her cleaner. Doesn't talk, doesn't blink. Just collects problems and makes them disappear." Alden didn't answer. He didn't need to. His hands moved faster. Ebb placed a revolver on the workbench and slid it across without a word. "Not sayin' you need it," he muttered. "Just sayin', don't be the only one without a plan." The implication sat heavy between them. Alden looked over at Dusty, the colt now standing tall, alert, stronger than ever. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was living proof of something Cressida wanted buried. And if Alden didn't act, he'd lose him all over again. They decided to move at dusk. Ebb knew of an old ranch far off the grid, owned by a friend who hated Cressida enough to keep his mouth shut. "You got one shot to vanish," he warned. "After that, she'll start making phone calls you can't outrun." The plan was simple. Get Dusty out by night, off the back trails, no headlights. Just dirt roads and prayers. Alden agreed, but in his heart, he knew it wouldn't be enough. That afternoon, a woman stepped out of the SUV. Black coat, black gloves, sunglasses too dark for the light. Monroe. She stood at the edge of the road and just watched. 4 hours. She never approached the gate. Never made a move. But her presence said everything. "I see you. I know what you're hiding. And I will come for it." That night, as Alden loaded Dusty into the trailer and tied the last knot, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear that came from hope. He finally had something worth protecting. And someone dangerous enough to take it from him. As the engine turned over and the headlights cut into the dusk, a shadow moved on the ridge. Watching. Waiting. The trailer bounced along the dirt road, its wheels kicking up clouds of pale dust that shimmered in the moonlight. Inside, Dusty stood calmly, his legs braced as if he understood what was happening. Alden gripped the steering wheel tight, eyes scanning the dark horizon. He hadn't felt this hunted since the war, but this time there were no uniforms, no enemy lines. Just secrets, power, and a woman who erased people without leaving a trace. They drove in silence for hours, avoiding paved roads and passing only the occasional mailbox swallowed by weeds. Ebb had drawn out the route on a napkin with shaky hands and the kind of precision only fear can create. At one point, Alden slowed near a cattle gate and checked his rear-view mirror, headlights. Just a flicker. Then gone. He told himself it was nothing. But the knot in his gut said otherwise. Around 2 a.m., they stopped to rest under a canopy of cottonwoods near a dried-up creek. Alden opened the trailer door, and Dusty stepped out slowly, stretching his legs and nuzzling Alden's chest like a child seeking comfort. Alden crouched beside him, running a hand along the colt's neck. "You weren't supposed to exist," he whispered. "But here you are." His voice cracked. "And somehow, you gave me a reason to." The memory of Seraphine flashed through his mind, the way she carried herself like a queen, and the day Cressida ordered her taken away. Alden had said nothing then. He'd buried that guilt for years. Saving Dusty didn't erase it, but it gave him a chance to do what he couldn't before: stand up. Protect something innocent from being destroyed just to protect someone's legacy. He looked at Dusty and saw more than a horse. He saw his own redemption. They rode on through the early morning light, reaching the edge of an abandoned cattle property as the sun began to rise. Ebb's friend had left a key in the mailbox, just as promised. The house was falling apart, the barn half collapsed, but it was shelter. It was something. Alden led Dusty into the paddock and locked the gate behind him. Then he sat on the porch, shotgun across his knees, waiting for whatever came next. But a part of him knew, hiding wouldn't be enough. Cressida Vale didn't need to find you to destroy you. All she needed was to pull the right string. And somewhere out there, a string was already unraveling. The ranch house creaked with every gust of wind, as if protesting its own collapse. Alden sat at the kitchen table, tracing circles on the dusty wood with his thumb, eyes fixed on nothing. Dusty rested in the makeshift paddock out back, lying under the shade of a leaning oak. For the first time since the desert, the colt looked safe. But safety, Alden knew, was just an illusion stretched thin, and that morning it tore. The knock came just after sunrise. Not loud. Just 3 calm, deliberate raps against the warped front door. Alden froze. He stood, shotgun in hand, and approached slowly. But when he opened the door, it wasn't Monroe. It wasn't a ranch hand or a cop. It was someone worse. Lucinda Pike, his daughter. He hadn't seen her in almost 15 years. Not since the day she left after a fight that split the family down the middle. She looked older, harder. Her hair was tied back, her jeans dusty. But her eyes were the same, piercing, disappointed, and full of questions she didn't ask yet. "I got a call," she said. "Not from her. From Ebb." Alden's throat tightened. "Said you were in trouble. That you had a horse worth dying for." She stepped inside, looking around the wreck of the house. "Didn't say you were hiding like a criminal." Lucinda was once a vet tech, brilliant with animals, proud of her independence, and unforgiving when it came to lies. She had walked away from her father the day she found out he'd helped cover up the disappearance of a horse named Seraphine. She'd begged him to speak up back then. He didn't. That silence cost him his daughter. Now, Dusty brought her back, but not with forgiveness. With questions. "I saw the colt," she said, looking through the back window. "He's Hollow Crown's blood, isn't he?" Alden nodded once. She didn't respond right away. Then, with quiet fury, she asked, "And how many lives did Cressida destroy to keep that secret buried?" Alden lowered his head. "Too many." Lucinda stared at him. "And now you're next." She turned toward the door. "We need to move again." Tonight. Alden watched her step outside into the light, her silhouette strong and certain, just like her mother's used to be. He felt the weight of everything he'd done, and everything he hadn't. But now, with Lucinda back and Dusty still breathing, he had a chance to fight not just for the colt, but for the family he thought he'd already lost. The first sign came with the rumble of engines far too smooth to belong to ranch trucks. Lucinda spotted the dust cloud before Alden did, 2 SUVs, black and silent, moving fast across the horizon. No headlights, no hesitation. "She found us," Lucinda said, already moving. Alden stepped out onto the porch, shotgun in hand. Dusty neighed from the paddock, his hooves pacing nervously. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long blood-orange shadows across the land. They didn't have time to run. Not this time. Lucinda turned to her father. "We split," she said firmly. "I take Dusty out through the creek bed. You draw them toward the ridge." "It's the only way." Alden shook his head. "No. I won't leave you alone with him." But Lucinda's jaw was already set. "You taught me how to ride, how to shoot, how to read terrain. Let me do what you raised me for." Alden looked at her, really looked at her, not as the little girl who stormed out of the house all those years ago, but as a woman standing on her own ground. Dusty stood behind her now, calm and alert, as if waiting for his cue. Alden stepped forward, placed a hand on the colt's forehead, and whispered something only Dusty could hear. Then he handed Lucinda the map Eb had drawn and kissed her forehead. "Get him out. No matter what." The SUVs stopped at the base of the property. Doors opened. Men in dark clothes stepped out. One of them was Monroe. No sunglasses this time. Her eyes were colder than glass, fixed on the barn like a hawk on a mouse. Alden took a deep breath and walked out into the open, shotgun slung but visible. "You're trespassing," he called. "This is private land." Monroe didn't speak. She simply nodded toward the barn. 2 men moved in that direction. Fast. From the tree line behind the barn, Dusty and Lucinda slipped away unseen. They took the old cattle trail toward the south, hidden by brush and fading light. Alden turned and fired a single shot in the air, pulling all eyes back to him. "You want something?" he shouted. "Come take it." It worked. 3 of them started toward him, leaving the barn behind. He just needed a few more minutes, a few more steps, to buy Lucinda enough time. But as Monroe approached, something in her expression changed. She slowed, tilted her head, and whispered something into a radio. Then she turned her eyes toward the ridge, the exact direction Lucinda was heading. Alden's heart slammed in his chest. They weren't fooled. They knew. And now, the race wasn't just for escape. It was for survival. Lucinda urged Dusty forward, guiding him through the narrow creek bed lined with mesquite and low-hanging branches. The trail was barely wide enough, but the colt moved with instinct, trusting her completely. Behind them, the roar of engines grew louder. She could hear voices now, not yelling, but methodical, trained. Cressida hadn't sent cowboys. She'd sent professionals. And they were closing in. Alden watched from the ridge, wind whipping through his hair as he fired a warning shot toward the men below. It was enough to stall them, but not enough to stop them. Monroe didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her stance, eyes fixed on her target. "You think you're buying time?" she called up to him. "You're just dragging it out." Alden's voice cracked with fury. "That colt doesn't belong to you." Monroe smirked. "He doesn't belong to anyone." At the bottom of the ridge, Lucinda emerged from the creek and spotted the second SUV cutting off her escape route. They'd anticipated this. Panic surged, but she didn't stop. Instead, she veered hard left, toward the open range. Dusty followed, hooves pounding dry earth. A shot cracked behind them, a warning or a threat, she couldn't tell. She didn't look back. There was no space for doubt. Only forward. Atop the ridge, Alden saw it unfold, the trap tightening, Lucinda caught between two forces. He knew what Cressida wanted. Silence. And Dusty wasn't just a horse. He was living proof of everything she'd hidden. Her lies, her cruelty, her betrayal of the very bloodlines she claimed to protect. With trembling hands, Alden reached into his pocket and pulled out the old magazine photo. Hollow crown, Seraphine, and the blood that ran in Dusty's veins. He dropped the shotgun and held the photo high, stepping into view. "You want him?" he shouted. "Then take this. Take the truth, and let the world see what you really are." Monroe hesitated. She lifted a radio, her eyes narrowing. This wasn't part of the plan. Exposure wasn't the mission. Silence was. And Alden had just changed the game. Behind them, Dusty and Lucinda cleared the last rise before the highway. A pair of headlights approached, not black SUVs this time, but an old ranch truck. Ebb. He'd come through, just like he always did. Lucinda waved frantically as Dusty stumbled, exhausted but determined. And as the colt fell into the back of the trailer and the engine roared to life, a single truth burned clear. They weren't running anymore. They were fighting back. The morning broke cold and golden, stretching across the open land like a breath of relief. Dusty stood quietly inside Ebb's old corral, his coat glistening under the early sun. He bore no visible scars from what happened the night before, but Lucinda saw it in his eyes. The awareness, the strength, the survival. She leaned on the fence, arms folded, watching him with something deeper than admiration, something like faith. Inside the house, Alden sat at the kitchen table, bruised and tired but alive. A thermos of coffee steamed beside him as he stared at the photo of Hollow Crown and Seraphine one last time. Across the table, Ebb thumbed through a worn leather notebook, full of records, breeding charts, and veterinary reports he'd kept hidden for years. "It's all here," Ebb said quietly. "The lineage, the fake registries, the erased reports, everything Cressida buried." Alden nodded. "Then it's time to dig it back up." Lucinda made the first call, to a journalist who once tried to expose Cressida and got blackballed for it. Then to an old vet who had treated Seraphine in secret. Within days, the first article hit the web, the bloodline buried in the desert. Photos followed. Testimonies. Evidence. The story caught fire. Cressida Vale responded with silence at first, then with denial. But the damage had already been done. The public didn't just turn on her, they dissected her legacy piece by piece. Lawsuits began to surface. Investigations opened. Sponsors pulled out. And through it all, Dusty became a symbol, not just of survival, but of truth that refuses to stay buried. Alden kept him close, but never hidden. The colt was no longer a secret. He was a living challenge to everything Cressida once controlled. And for the first time in decades, Alden walked through town without shame in his shoulders. Lucinda didn't move back home, but she came often. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real. They spoke not just about the past, but about what came next. Dusty had potential. Maybe not for racing, but for something bigger, a new kind of legacy. One built on honesty, second chances, and courage. And in that, Alden found peace. Not because the past was erased, but because he'd finally stopped running from it. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Dusty trotted across the field, strong and free. Alden watched from the porch, hand resting on his knee, a quiet smile on his face. The wind moved through the tall grass like a whisper. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't sound like regret, it sounded like redemption.